To me, the most beautiful word in the dictionary is tariff, and it's my favorite word. It needs a public relations firm.
Donald Trump threatened China with a 10% tariff. He also threatened Canada and Mexico with a 25% tariff. In this video, I want to answer the following questions.
What is a tariff? Who pays for a tariff? Will the Trump tariffs cause more inflation? Can Trump enact his tariffs? Tariff is a tax placed on goods that cross national borders. The most common kind is an import tariff. Import tariffs tax goods that are brought into the country. Conversely, there are export tariffs, which tax goods sent from the US to other countries. The US Constitution forbids export tariffs. Let's see how a 10% tariff on China will unfold. Suppose that Walmart imports t-shirts from China. Imagine Chinese t-shirt producers charge Walmart a wholesale price of $1 per shirt. After paying Chinese suppliers $1 per shirt, Walmart also pays a tariff duty of 10 cents or 10% on $1. The tariff is paid to the US Customs Border Protection Service. Walmart adds an average markup of 25% when it sells products in its stores. So, before this 10% tariff, US consumers paid $1.25. With a 10% tariff, Walmart has an option to pass down the entire cost of tariff to consumers. If it maintains its 25% markup, the price goes up to $1.38. At the same time, the US government gets to keep 10 cents for each t-shirt imported. Walmart earns 28 cents on each shirt versus 25 cents from before. Chinese producers earn the same $1 per shirt, but the US consumers stand to lose most as they have to pay a higher price.
This is a simplistic example. It assumes that all the burden of a tariff is passed down to US consumers. In reality, this is rarely the case.
The first factor is competition. Selling t-shirts is competitive. There are tons of tees imported from many countries. Walmart can stop buying t-shirts from China and shift to other suppliers. Then, Chinese suppliers may lower prices and absorb partially or fully the 10% tariff. Otherwise, they will stand to lose their business. Alternatively, Chinese t-shirt companies may play shenanigans. They can re-import their China-made t-shirts to the US through no-tariff countries, but they have to somehow conceal the origin of t-shirts. Conversely, what if there is a little competition? For instance, 80% of toys produced globally come from China. With fewer alternatives, toys in the US stores will become more expensive with a tariff. The same thing applies to electronics. A lot of it is made in China. Given little room for substitution, US consumers will face higher prices on gadgets.
Another factor whether a tariff causes big or small spike in inflation is the product in question. Recall our previous example with toys. Even though most of the toys are imported from China, US consumers may choose to buy fewer of them given the higher price. It's not like a necessity product like food or shelter. Conversely, what if the taxed good is a necessity and with fewer alternatives? Well, in that case, inflation from tariff will be much more pronounced. Another factor to consider is the size of the US market. The United States has a large consumer base that accounts for a large share of global consumption. So what if Trump imposes a 25% tariff on Canadian oil? Well, in that case, Canadian producers may have to absorb at least partially this tariff and keep the lid on the inflation that comes from the tariff, since they can't find immediately new markets and probably they are quite dependent on their sales to US customers. So that way they will be able to stay competitive and continue selling oil to US customers, and at the same time perhaps keep a lid on inflation.
Domestic production also plays a big role in the extent of inflation from tariffs. In case of oil, the US has a large crude oil production base. US suppliers may increase production and compensate for lower oil imports from Canada. Of course, there are many factors to consider here, as things are usually not that simple in real life. In other words, domestic producers will be unable to fully compensate, especially on a short-term basis. This is especially true for consumers living close close to the Canadian border.
So why Trump is pursuing tariffs? The typical goal for a tariff is to protect domestic production.
In 2018, Trump imposed a 20% tariff on all washing machines imports. The tariff rate went up to 50% once a certain quota was reached. Many washers and dryers are produced in developing countries with lower wages. They also have less stringent labor and environment regulations. For instance, Samsung produces many of its laundry appliances in Thailand, Vietnam, and China. Wages are several times smaller in these countries compared to the US. On top of it, the US has a strong labor union presence. Arguably, this can make labor costs even higher in the US. Inevitably, labor cost and regulation differences make imports into the US cheaper.
American companies such as Whirlpool struggle to compete with imported goods. Of course, there is a question whether Whirlpool and similar domestic producers run their businesses efficiently or not. But still, higher labor cost in the US versus the rest of the world remains a crucial factor in all this.
So why would you enact tariffs if US consumers may face higher prices? Besides protecting domestic manufacturers, there is another goal at play.
The higher the tariff, the more you're going to put on the value of that piece, those goods, the higher people are going to have to pay in shops.
Ready? The higher the tariff, the more likely it is that the company will come into the United States and build a factory in the United States so it doesn't have to pay the tariff.
That will take many, that will take many years.
In fact, I'll tell you, there's another theory is that the tariff, you make it so high, so horrible, so obnoxious that they'll come right away.
Trump wanted to encourage Samsung, LG, and other companies to set up shops in the US. That way, the US economy and workers get to benefit from wages and local production. If we look at price action for laundry equipment, we see a spike around the time the tariff got enacted. But as time went by, the price stabilized. In the meantime, LG and Samsung built manufacturing facilities in the southern US and created over 2,000 new jobs. These factories seem to have been planned before the tariff took effect, though. In 2023, the tariff expired. So was this laundry tariff a conclusive success? On the surface, it may seem like so. More jobs were created in the US, and the price of laundry equipment seems to be not much higher compared to 2014. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. We have to take many things into account. After all, in those years, consumers had to overpay for washers. Also, what would happen with no tariffs in place? Would US consumers continue benefiting from lower-priced imports? Would laundry equipment prices be even lower than what they are today? Would Whirlpool and other US producers have to close down and lay off workers? How about the quality of Whirlpool washers versus Samsung or LG?
And don't forget the retaliatory tariffs. Other countries responded with their own tariffs that negatively affected US exports. For instance, China imposed 25% tariff on US soybeans in 2018. By 2020, US soybeans production declined by 17%, and the US government had to provide aid and subsidies to US farmers, which were quite costly. Without a tariff and industrial policy, we can argue that cheap imports can hollow out entire industries in the US. This is actually what happened to the US Rust Belt. Actually, US Rust Belt was known before as a steel belt, and this region included states like Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and many others.
Around 1980s to 1990s, the US liberalized and pursued free trade policies. As a result, the Rust Belt saw mass closures of its plants, especially in the steel manufacturing. The MIT economist found that from 1999 to 2011, the US lost over 2 million jobs due to China import competition. What's worse is that offsetting job gains from other industries barely materialized. In other words, many of these laid-off workers were left behind unemployed with poor job prospects. This leads me to a typical argument in favor of tariffs, that is, to have an industrial policy to protect strategically important industries. The secondary consideration for that is to preserve jobs in the economy. We can say that metal production is very important given its wide application in the economy. Arguably, the same thing goes for medicine and perhaps green energy products. Of course, it all depends on how you look at it and lobbying. Also, what if a certain product comes from only one country, which is unfriendly? Things can turn bad.
Let's come back to the question of whether the Trump tariff will cause inflation. It doesn't seem like Trump wants to protect a specific industry. Instead, he wants China, Canada, and Mexico to pay attention to his demands. What are they? They are to stem illegal immigration and the flow of deadly fentanyl chemicals from China.
Will these blanket tariffs cause inflation? Here's my honest opinion. The answer is a definite yes. But to what extent? That's a harder question to answer. It depends on those factors that we discussed before. It is unlikely we will see inflation in the realm of 10% from China or 25% from Canada or Mexico. Some of the tariffs' burden will be absorbed by importers as well as manufacturers, no doubt. But regardless, the price will likely go up. About 2/3 of all global trade is in intermediate goods, meaning it's not the final products like car or a laptop that will bear the most burden of tariffs. The inputs such as materials and parts that US producers use for final products will be taxed too.
Here's another question. Can Trump enact such sweeping tariffs? Before the 1930s, the Congress set tariffs, but today is a different world.
In the early 1900s, the US government received over 40% of its revenues from tariffs. Zoom to 2013, and tariffs accounted for only 2%. Over the years, the Congress has allowed the president to set tariffs on his own. There are two main laws that allow presidents to set tariffs. The first one is so-called Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. It allows the president to set tariffs on imports that threaten US national security. Trump used Section 232 to set a 10% tariff on aluminum and 25% on steel products. The second law is Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974. The law allows the president to impose tariffs to address unfair acts of a foreign government that burden US commerce. China requires foreign companies to transfer intellectual property for doing business there. Trump set Section 301 tariffs on Chinese goods to address this unfair policy. The tariffs, ranging from 7.5% to 25%, affected $360 billion of goods traded with China in 2021. Biden also used Section 301 tariffs. He imposed tariffs on green technology products from China to protect domestic manufacturing. A notable tariff was 100% tax on electric vehicles from China. This effectively shut down any possibility for Chinese EVs making their way into the US through imports. Finally, there is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. The law allows the president to regulate international commerce during a national emergency. This includes the ability to set tariffs. Some argue that Trump can declare a national emergency due to illegal immigration or fentanyl drug crisis. That way he can impose tariffs on Mexico.
Of course, the Congress can take that authority back from the president. There are already bills sponsored by Democratic representatives that are intending to do that. But these bills will face an uphill battle in the Congress controlled by Republicans.
So here's my honest take on all this. I don't think that Trump will go through on his blanket tariff threat. Instead, he will make demands and force the three countries to sit down and see what they can do to meet his demands. Blanket tariffs will be bad and politically damaging for Trump and the Republican Party. High inflation was a sticking point during the 2024 presidential election. Inflation was a big negative for the Harris-Walz campaign, and they struggled to fight it off. Trump will tread carefully not to alienate his electorate and unleash more inflation. If things get worse, Trump may enact tariffs. However, they will be likely targeted in nature with specific industries in mind. Regardless, they will still most likely have an inflationary effect, but perhaps less noticeable compared to blanket tariffs.
In the past, Trump walked back and reneged on his promises. He often uses threats as a negotiating tactic. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. He won't know until he tries. And the Congress is unlikely to stop him from doing so. But the US consumers and inflation from tariffs are the things that will keep him at check. And that is it for this video. I hope it was helpful. Please like, share and subscribe for more useful content in the future. All the best!